How do you know that a church staff position is going to be a good fit? I don't know what the current statistics are, but the last time I looked at it, the average church staff member, like an associate pastor or youth pastor, something like that, is about 18 months. That's only a year and 6 months. And last time I looked at it, it was actually shrinking. Not only is this a huge waste of time, money, and resources for the local church, it's also kind of a frustrating thing for young guys who are first getting out of Bible college, where a lot of Christian colleges and universities place an emphasis on trying to make sure that their ministerial students are placed in some area of ministry. Probably some additional emphasis should be placed on how to help those graduates find out if that ministry is going to be a good fit for them. Unfortunately, I've watched a lot of guys who were not properly placed in ministry, and the result was that they were very quickly not even just moving from church to church, but eventually just burnt out and totally out of ministry altogether. And these are guys that, if they had been properly placed, probably could have ended up pastoring some churches and really doing some other things for the Lord. And maybe you could argue for that one way or the other, but I just wish that they had been able to find a place that was a good fit for them. So here are some principles that I would encourage you to look for. First of all, you should make the obvious consideration if the overall church vision and doctrine aligns with your core purposes and beliefs as an individual. It is going to be especially hard for you to find tenure in a particular ministry where the core things that they believe and practice and their core goals and purposes are not congruent with what you believe as a person. So I think it almost goes without saying to make sure to check the church doctrinal statement and then check the practice of the church and just kind of see what direction that they're taking overall. The next thing that I think is a really key element in trying to make sure that you are properly placed when you step into ministry is the preaching of that church. A lot of times when guys are going on church staff and when they're going into the ministry, they think in terms of the value that they're going to be able to add, but then they forget that they're actually going to be a church member at that church. They're going to be joining that church and functioning with that church as well. You wouldn't sit under that pastor and you would not want to be a part of that ministry as a regular church member if you were living within that community, then you probably will not be a good fit for that church on church staff. If you wouldn't otherwise join that church, don't think that a paycheck is going to make a difference. So check the preaching and make sure that as you listen to it, that this is a preacher that you can sit under and that you can learn from and that you will learn and grow from the pulpit ministry. And also be listening for things that might indicate that it's a toxic environment. I have known of some churches where the pastor used the pulpit as a bully pulpit, we call it, or a whipping post to beat up on the people, where basically you could kind of detect from his sermons that he preached whatever was the burr under his saddle. That is an incredibly toxic environment if your pastor is not preaching or teaching regularly through the Word of God and allowing the Word of God to set the agenda for the pulpit. This doesn't mean that the pulpit is not the place to address some of the larger issues within the church, but it's certainly not the place to beat up the people, that's for sure. You need to preach the Bible, not the congregation. The next thing that I would recommend that you look for is what kinds of methods does the pastor use for equipping and developing the staff? Now, I want you to be careful as you go into interviews that you don't come across as though you're the one who's interviewing and that you're looking for what you can get out of it. But you need to also think about the fact that you want to be in ministry for the long haul, or maybe you are going to that place, not necessarily using it as a stepping stone, but to learn and grow and develop yourself because you feel like that you have aspirations to one day be a pastor. Those things being the case, how does the pastor equip and invest in his staff? At one church where I served, they would pay for half of the ongoing education of their staff because they realized that as they allowed their church staff to continue to receive an education, that the church overall would benefit from that continuing growth and development of staff people. In some churches, there might be a fund that's available for the staff to go to conferences and to retreats, and maybe they go to those things annually. Is there a regular weekly staff meeting? Is the staff reading through books together to grow as a team and have a common culture? Are there lessons at this staff meeting? Those are some things that you'll be able to pick up on to see if that church prioritizes investing in people as opposed to just depleting them and trying to get things out of them. One word of balance on that, however, is that a lot of guys go into ministry fresh out of Bible college with the idea that they're going to find a pastor who's going to be a specific individual personal mentor with them. But if that pastor is pastoring a church of any size, he's got a lot of concerns on his plate. Even a small church of 100 can have a roll of 300 plus who are kind of cycling through or rotating on a regular basis. There are auxiliary ministries of that church. There are other lay ministers and leaders. There are deacons and lots of people that pastor has to pour himself into. And on top of that, has to take time in his personal life for his family, and then he might be preaching and have an external pulpit ministry and other things that he has going on. So don't expect that just because this guy is going to have some mentorship in your life, that you're going to have all of these intense and personal one-on-one development moments all the time. He may not have the time to do that with you every single week. So just try to look for some areas of the ministry where there is some equipping take place and find out if that meets what you think is going to be necessary for your personal development. That way, when you go there, you haven't built something up in your mind that's not realistic, and you're not disappointed when those needs are not met. The next thing I would encourage you to look at is the schedule of the ministry. Ask this question: what does a typical work week look like? Be careful how you ask about this, because you need to know that the older generation perceives the younger generation as lazy and thinks that there is no work ethic among younger people. So if you ask questions about that, there may be an assumption that you don't have the work ethic that's necessary to make it a ministry, because you need to know that when you're in ministry, that it is not a 9-to-5 job. You're not just punching the clock. But at the same time, there should be some level of indication that there's a healthy work-life balance. Ministry goes through ebbs and flows, and there are going to be certain times of the year where you're going to be busier and certain times of the year where things are going to be slower. But you can pick up on routines of healthy scheduling within that ministry. You really shouldn't go and work for a ministry unless God absolutely leads you to do it, where the expectation is that you work from sun up till sundown 7 days a week. That's not sustainable. Some of the ways that you'll be able to know this is, does the pastor take a day off? I used to work for a pastor who joked about how that in his early days, he never took a day off, and that some members of the church would ask him about that, and he would say, well, the devil never takes a day off. And then they said to him, well, is it the devil's example that we should be following? Obviously, God rested on the seventh day. So as you start in ministry, be sure that you're willing to work hard and make sure that that's clear, but also be looking for those elements that help you to understand, is the workload reasonable? Is there balance for time for ministry and time for family? Because if you let the ministry tear your family apart, then you have no ministry. So it is reasonable to have some boundaries in your life. They that wait on the Lord will have renewed strength. And God doesn't just deplete his servants entirely and take everything that they have out of them and absolutely drain them. God invests enough in us, and he does give back. And he even said as a principle in the Old Testament of a rest day. Another thing I would encourage you to look for is, what is the staff turnover rate? Like, how rapidly do staff turn around at that church? If they're regularly seeing a revolving door of staff people and there's no longevity, then there may be an indicator that it's an unhealthy environment. And then also, how are former staff treated and spoken of? Is every severing relationship just an absolute burning of the bridge? Is there an indication in some way that nobody can leave on positive terms? You might respect that pastor, you might appreciate that, but you don't want to go work in an environment like that, because you're going to be the next person who's going to be lambasted. It's just an indication that this is a pattern problem within that ministry. And what are the former staff saying? Sometimes in our very public society, there can be some indicators like on social media and different things that sort of indicate how the other staff person saw that situation as they were leaving it. And you need to just be able to balance all of the things that you see from one side or the other, because you know that there is one person's side, another person's side, and then there's the actual truth. So you need to be able to look through those things and have some discernment about that. But if it is a recurring pattern, then be aware of that. Now, in the absence of staff turnover, then try to look for some indicators of like church membership turnover rates as well. If that church is just constantly burning through church members all the time and they're scattered all over the community and they're indicators that the church members have had bad experiences and could not leave on good terms, and that was a consistent pattern, then that might be an indicator that it might not be a good environment to work within as well. I realize that it can be very taboo to talk about money in a ministry interview, and so I want to caution you on bringing it up whatsoever, but there are going to be some other indicators that you can perhaps look for to be able to determine if this is a good fit and if they are likely to pay a livable wage. If there are other staff, look around at perhaps where the staff live and their housing situation and see if they can afford to live in the area and how they're able to do that. Also, find out if there's a church budget and maybe if you can take a look at it. If there is not a written church budget and you cannot discern what the process is for determining how money is spent in the church, I'm telling you from experience, run for the hills. Because from experience, I know what it's like to work on a church staff where they literally did not pay the staff on time or sometimes at all. And you might be willing to do anything for the Lord and for the sake of the ministry and all those different things, but you have to feed your family and you're going to have bills to pay and you're going to be reliant on that ministry. So there has to be some latitude for you to be able to either work outside of the ministry and then to serve in a bivocational capacity or something that will make sure that you have the wages that are necessary for you to live. One very important thing that I will add to that, though, is that you need to remember that serving in ministry is very different from other vocations and that you are operating by faith. And as long as you're working in an environment where you feel like that God has led you there and that there's some cooperation from the leadership to allow you to be able to do some work, maybe on the side or otherwise to earn some additional income if that were necessary, and God leads you, then you should definitely do that and trust that God is going to provide for you. But if it's nowhere on the pastor or the church's radar to pay a livable wage and there's going to be no cooperation for you to be able to do so, they're going to expect you to work full-time for like part-time pay, for example, then you probably need to look elsewhere.